Close your eyes and let the mind drift backward through time. Imagine the quiet hum of history, a vast current carrying us from one age to the next. Beneath its surface runs a darker thread, the story of slavery. A story older than empires, older than writing, older than kings. Tonight, we follow that thread. Slowly, calmly, with the gentleness of one drifting toward sleep. Long before cities rose, before pyramids and palaces, people lived in small bands and villages. They hunted, they gathered, they farmed in quiet fields. But as soon as humans began to wage war, to conquer neighbors, and to capture rather than kill, slavery was born. The defeated, instead of being slain, were bound. They were made to labor, to serve, to carry burdens that were not theirs. In Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization, the first clay tablets mention slaves. Some were captives from war. Others were debtors, selling themselves or their children in exchange for survival. Under the harsh sun of Sumer, slaves pressed bricks, irrigated fields, and spun wool in workshops. In Babylon, the famous Code of Hammurabi laid down rules. Slaves could be branded on the forehead, bought and sold like cattle. Yet even then, there were glimmers of humanity. Some could buy their freedom. Some were granted release after years of service. Across the desert in Egypt, slavery took a different form. Egyptian society was rigid, with pharaohs towering above all. Foreigners, often captured in war, were set to work in fields or quarries, or in the households of nobles. The Hebrews remembered their bondage there and passed their story through generations. But not all Egyptian slaves suffered the same. Some rose to trusted positions. Some even married into Egyptian society. Slavery was a shadow in the land of pyramids, but it was not always chains alone. It was a shifting spectrum of servitude. Farther east, in India, the ancient Vedic texts spoke of dasa, a word for both servant and slave. In some ages, it meant conquered peoples. In others, bonded laborers. Indian society was shaped by hierarchy, by caste, and those at the bottom often found themselves bound to others. Some scholars argue that slavery there was more like serfdom, tied to land, to duty, to debt, yet the loss of freedom remained. And in China, dynasties rose and fell, each carrying its own forms of servitude. Prisoners of war became slaves. Criminals were condemned to labor. Families sometimes sold children in famine. In the great palaces of Han emperors, eunuchs served with loyalty, though their freedom was long gone. On distant farms, peasants sank into debt in servitude. Across continents, across cultures, slavery emerged not as an exception, but as a constant companion of human civilization. Pause here and let the mind drift across the Mediterranean. The world of Greece and Rome comes into view. In Athens, the birthplace of democracy, tens of thousands of slaves labored so citizens could vote and debate. They worked the silver mines at Lorient, where dust filled the lungs and chains rattled in the dark. Others served in households, teaching children, cooking meals, even managing estates. Greek philosophers wrote of freedom, of virtue, of justice. Yet most accepted slavery as natural. Aristotle once argued that some men were born to rule, others to serve. His words would echo across centuries. Rome built upon this system and magnified it. The Roman Empire was, at its heart, a slave society. War after war brought captives from Gaul, from Greece, from Africa, from the East. In Rome itself, perhaps a third of the people were enslaved. They poured wine at banquets. They built aqueducts. They rowed the galleys of warships. Some were gladiators, forced to fight for amusement. Others were scholars, physicians, scribes. The brutality was real crucifixion, branding, chains. But manumission was common too. Freedmen became citizens, sometimes even rich and influential. The paradox of Rome was clear. Freedom and slavery existed side by side, woven into one fabric. Now let us shift gently as faith enters the story. In the Hebrew scriptures, the memory of bondage in Egypt shaped laws of compassion. Servitude was limited. Jubilees promised freedom after cycles of years. Though foreigners could still be held for life, the moral tension lived in the text itself, a call to remember slavery and to treat others with kindness. In the Christian world, the paradox deepened. Jesus spoke of freedom, of release for the oppressed. His death on the cross, a punishment once reserved for slaves, became a symbol of redemption. Yet letters from Paul urged obedience, telling slaves to serve faithfully, while also telling masters to treat them gently. The spiritual equality of all souls was preached, even as earthly chains remained. Across centuries, bishops, popes, and monasteries owned slaves, even while scriptures whispered, "There is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, for all are one." In the Islamic world, a new voice arose. The Quran did not abolish slavery, but it urged mercy. Believers were encouraged to free slaves as an act of righteousness. Masters were told to treat them with kindness, to allow them to earn their freedom. Some slaves rose to power, serving as generals, rulers, and scholars. Yet the markets of Baghdad and Cairo were filled with captives, brought across deserts and seas. The contradiction was clear, a call for compassion, but a persistence of chains. Across faiths, the pattern was the same. Slavery was never fully rejected, yet seeds were planted the idea of dignity, of equality, of freedom as divine. These seeds would sleep for centuries, waiting for their time to grow. As the medieval world unfolded, slavery changed its face. In Europe, outright slavery declined after Rome fell, but serfdom rose. Serfs were tied to the land, bound to lords, unable to leave without permission. It was not slavery in name, but in practice, freedom was little more than a dream. In cities, debtors could still be sold. Prisoners of war were enslaved. Yet gradually, in Christian Europe, slavery itself became rarer. In Africa, however, systems of servitude thrived. In the great empires of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, slaves worked fields, served courts, and marched in armies. Some were taken in war, others through trade. Yet slavery there was often different from the chattel slavery that would come later. Many enslaved people could marry, own property, or rise to status. Slavery in Africa was diverse, complex, and deeply rooted in society. In the Islamic world, the medieval centuries saw vast networks of trade. Slaves were carried across the Sahara by camel, across the Red Sea by dhow, across the Silk Road by caravan. Some were soldiers, forming elite corps like the Mamluks, who even rose to rule Egypt. Others were servants, concubines, laborers. Some were treated with respect, others with cruelty. the institution persisted, woven into economy and empire. And in Viking Europe, raiding brought new captives. Slavic peoples from whom the very word slave derives were taken in great numbers, sold across markets from Dublin to Constantinople. The Norse ships carried not just silver and furs, but human lives. Across the medieval world, slavery endured, shifting its forms but never disappearing. It existed in castles and huts, in deserts and forests, in mosques and monasteries. Always present, always hidden in plain sight. The story so far is vast, a story of bondage across civilizations, softened by moments of mercy, sharpened by cruelty. A story shaped by faith, by war, by trade. And as the medieval centuries gave way to the dawn of exploration, the stage was set for slavery's darkest chapter, the age of transatlantic chains. The medieval world drifts into twilight. Castles rise on hilltops. Pilgrims walk dusty roads. Merchants sail across seas. And in this shifting world, new horizons open. Horizons of exploration. Horizons of conquest. Horizons of profit. With them came a darkness deeper than before, the age of Atlantic slavery. Picture the year 1444. On the shores of Lagos in Portugal, ships return from Africa. Their holds are filled not just with gold and ivory, but with men, women, and children. Chroniclers record the scene. Hundreds of captives marched in chains, weeping as buyers crowd to purchase them. Some are sent to labor in Portugal's fields. Others are carried farther, across the ocean, to islands in the Atlantic where sugarcane grows tall. Sugar, a plant so sweet, yet so cruel. The first plantations rose on Madeira, the Canary Islands, and Eso Tom. They needed endless labor. Africans, captured and traded by rival tribes or seized by Portuguese raiders, were forced to cut cane beneath the burning sun. The model was set: the plantation, the overseer, the slave. Soon, it would leap across the Atlantic. In 1492, Columbus reached the Caribbean. His voyages opened the Americas to European conquest. With them came disease that devastated indigenous peoples. Entire populations fell to smallpox, measles, influenza. Colonists, desperate for labor, turned to Africa. By the early 1500s, Spanish ships carried enslaved Africans to Hispaniola, Cuba, Mexico, and Peru. They worked in mines, in fields, in kitchens. The system spread like fire. Imagine the crossing itself, the Middle Passage. A voyage across thousands of miles of ocean in the dark belly of a ship. Men shackled together, row after row, unable to move. Women confined in separate quarters, vulnerable to abuse. Children crying. Disease spreading in the stale air. The stench unbearable. Mortality high. Perhaps 1 in 5 never survived the journey. Those who did emerged scarred, weakened, yet still forced to labor. The trade grew vast. Between the 1500s and 1800s, more than 12 million Africans were taken from their homelands. Millions more died in raids, marches to the coast, and the crossing itself. This was not just slavery as it had been known before. This was racial slavery, a system that marked black skin as permanently bound, justified by false ideas of inferiority, hardened into law. In the Caribbean, sugar was king. Plantations stretched for miles, worked by enslaved hands from dawn until night. The rhythm of the cane fields was relentless cut, load, crush, boil, repeat. The air filled with smoke from boiling houses. The crack of the overseer's whip cut through the sound of labor. Life expectancy was short. Many perished within years. And yet the cycle continued, fed by endless shipments of new captives. In Brazil, vast plantations grew sugar and later coffee, worked by enslaved Africans brought in staggering numbers. Brazil would receive more enslaved people than any other colony, nearly 5 million in total. On estates, in gold mines, in cities, the enslaved formed the backbone of Brazil's wealth. Some resisted by running to the forests, forming communities called quilombos. Palmares, the most famous, endured for nearly a century, a kingdom of freedom hidden in the jungle. In North America, the system grew differently. At first, slavery was one labor system among others. White indentured servants worked alongside Africans. But by the late 1600s, laws hardened racial lines. In Virginia, children inherited the status of their mother. If she was enslaved, they would be too, for life. Freedom became nearly impossible. Skin color marked destiny. By the 1700s, enslaved Africans and their descendants worked tobacco fields in Virginia, rice plantations in the Carolinas, indigo farms in Georgia. Later, cotton would rise to dominate the South. The wealth of Europe flowed from this system. Ships sailed in a triangle, manufactured goods from Europe to Africa, captives from Africa to the Americas, sugar and tobacco, from the Americas back to Europe. This triangular trade became the engine of an Atlantic world. Cities like Liverpool, Nantes, and Lisbon prospered. Merchants grew rich. Investors built empires, all upon the backs of the enslaved. And yet, in the midst of suffering, there was resistance. Enslaved people preserved languages, songs, beliefs. They told stories of ancestors and gods, weaving memory into survival. They ran away to forests and mountains. They rebelled, rising in uprisings across the Americas. Some succeeded, even if briefly. Each act of defiance was a spark of humanity refusing to die. In 1791, one spark ignited a revolution. In Saint-Domingue, the richest colony in the Caribbean, enslaved men and women rose in mass revolt. Led by Toussaint Louverture, they fought against planters, against French armies, against invaders from Spain and Britain. For more than a decade, they battled with extraordinary courage. In 1804, they declared independence, creating Haiti the first free black republic, born of a slave uprising. It was a turning point. The world trembled at the sight. Still, slavery endured elsewhere. In the American South, it became more entrenched than ever. Cotton, powered by the cotton gin, demanded endless labor. King Cotton fed the mills of Britain, fueling the Industrial Revolution. Millions toiled in fields, whipped and driven. Families torn apart on the auction block. Songs of sorrow and hope carried through the night. But winds of change were blowing. In Britain, a movement grew. Abolitionists, both black and white, spoke out. Former slaves, like Olaudah Equiano, published memoirs describing the horrors of the Middle Passage. Activists like William Wilberforce campaigned in Parliament. Across the country, Ordinary people boycotted sugar grown by enslaved labor. The conscience of a nation stirred. In 1807, Britain abolished the slave trade. Its navy began patrolling the seas, intercepting ships, freeing captives. In 1833, Britain abolished slavery itself across its empire. Compensation was paid not to the enslaved, but to the slaveholders. Still, freedom came. In the United States, the struggle lasted longer. Abolitionists like Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, and Sojourner Truth spoke with power. Tubman led fugitives to freedom along the Underground Railroad. Douglass, once enslaved himself, thundered in speeches and writings. The question of slavery tore the nation apart. In 1861, the Civil War erupted. 4 years of bloodshed followed. In 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. And in 1865, with the 13th Amendment, slavery was abolished across the United States. Brazil held on until 1888, the last nation in the Americas to abolish slavery. The Golden Law, signed by Princess Isabel, freed hundreds of thousands. The institution that had lasted millennia, that had crossed continents and oceans, was finally broken.